I want to jump to this post here from our good friends over at 2X Chromosomes on Reddit. A top post says, delete your dating apps. No more women on dating apps is the only language men speak. Plus, the less time you spend on Tinder, the more time you can spend protesting at the courthouse. Edit. To all men coming on here crying about how you're against this, of course you are. That's the point. F off. You know what I love about this? The kind of guy that's going to go to these women and be like, please don't leave the dating app. But I'm for abortion. Like
I'm an ally.
I'm an ally. It's like
a good guy.
They're just angering their own side. These men who are doing what they want. Meanwhile, conservatives are like, no, wait, don't delete your dating apps.
Well, it just goes to show you that like feminists don't like male feminists either.
Yeah, I mean, who does? No, but I think it's funny that this is the consistent argument. So we have this one post says, I deleted mine a while ago, but before this leak, I was just starting to consider trying again. Nope, F it. I'll stick to a vibrator in my imagination. Mr. Buzzy can't get me pregnant, can't lie about not having an STI, and doesn't care if I also see Mr. Rabbit or look at a Hitachi at the store. Yo, this is, there's, what's the right word? I don't want to say they're crazy, but they're kind of crazy to not understand the nuance in what's happening here. That they don't know what conservatives think about this. They've probably never even spoken to someone who is anti-abortion about what's really going on and why they think it. And the fact that these women probably live in blue states. I genuinely do not understand. I don't believe they actually know what they're arguing for or against.
Do you think that's what they're doing outside the Supreme Court justice houses? They're like deleting Tinder. They're like, we're not.
They're like, look, Kavanaugh, now you're not going to see me. You're going to be able to swipe, delete.
There are so many examples of the left circling back and coming back to traditional like social positions through like a back door. You know, I remember a few months ago, I was listening to Jordan Peterson interview this child psychologist from Canada. Apparently he's a big wig. He won like the Nobel Prize of Child Psychology or whatever. And he was he deals with like designing state interventions for children in disadvantaged homes and studies like how this affects their antisocial behavior, their violent behavior and stuff as they get older. And so he's describing how all these different programs would work. And he's describing this one in the middle. He says, so what we'll do is we'll have a social worker that'll come into the house, you know, of a single mother who maybe doesn't have any experience, doesn't really know like how to handle certain things when the kid does this or does that, how they're trying to communicate. And the social worker will be there who has this experience, who can kind of tell them like, oh, this is what the kid is trying to do, and like kind of walk them through these processes. And Peterson kind of pauses for a minute and he goes, well, that sounds like a grandmother. And it's like, then I realized everything he had been describing were just bureaucratic replacements for all of the things that have been lost over the last several decades. And that was one of them. And this is it just sort of happens that way.
Well, I want to mention there's also an additional component to this. You're correct that the left will end up in a roundabout way rediscovering some form of social conservatism or traditionalism. And then at that point, the right starts defending whatever it is the left was pushing for 50 years ago. And so historically, before we just had these like isolated nuclear families, people did tend to live with their older relatives, their older aunts or uncles or, parents were still living with them, helping them with the children. And now we're at a point where people are putting their father or mother in a nursing home when it's unnecessary just because they don't want to deal with them, and they're calling themselves pro-family conservatives.
Have you seen now what the far right is pushing? This is how it gets scary.
Bad.
They want this insane meme of rejecting modernity and returning to tradition. You're going to be shocked by what I'm going to show you. In a tweet from Jack Posobiec, he says, remember what they took from you.
He's
and
right,
this
though.
shocking image,
Dare they?
it's Pizza Hut and the Pac-Man machine, Book It, the red cups, the little dinosaurs, Care Bears, the Pizza Hut lamp. So Jack has been going on this, Pizza Hut nationalism thing?
He loves Pizza Hut.
Where it's like,
Weird.
Pizza Hut used to be great, and now it's basically, I'm kidding, by the way, about the far right stuff. The weird pizza claymation or whatever it was. He was telling a story how he took his kids to Pizza Hut because he remembered what it was like when he was a kid, and it was just trash. There was garbage everywhere. It was messy. He was like, what is this? And, I'll say he's obviously joking to quite a bit, but there is a bit of truth into what he's saying, that there were things that we had that were nice, that are now gone, that have fallen apart. And you mentioned it was a bureaucratic replacement. Darryl, you're talking about a grandmother and the state's replacement. I kind of feel like that's where we're going, where Pizza Hut still exists. But you go inside and it's a dry shell, lacking flavor, lacking anything other than you sit down, here's your pizza, get out.
The same thing happened after the 1960s. You go to like 1973 is when George Lucas, who was part of the New Directors movement, like these rebellious, Dennis Hopper, like all these new director types in the late 60s, Easy Rider, all that. George Lucas in 1973 makes American Graffiti, which is sort of, it began the sort of the cult of 1950s nostalgia, right? I don't know if you guys have ever seen it. It's like as much of a stereotypical kind of 1950s childhood movie as you can imagine. And he was open about like why he did it. He said, because everything that comes out now is depressing and it sucks. And for like the last several years, every film that's come out has just told us how bad we are, how evil the war is, how et cetera, and I just didn't want any more of that, and I don't think a lot of other people do too. And it started that trend. Happy Days came out like a year or two later after that. And for us, I think, we're kind of going through a similar thing. In the 80s and the early 90s are kind of our 1950s, you know?
There's that 70s show, which was the late 90s, right?
Yep.
And the crazy thing is, I think, is this true that, that 70s show was closer to the time period when it was released than we are to the 90s now?
Ugh.
Yeah, because
gross.
So they're doing a reboot, I think. Aren't they doing a reboot, that 90s show? And it's about the cast of that 70s show.
Wow.
And
they tried to do
later.
that 80s show. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was.
Oh, I thought you were going to say no.
No, but I think it might just be that people have nostalgia for when they were kids and they always thought it was better.
Well, that and it looks like Yum Food Brands bought, I don't know if they bought Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and KFC in 97.
China.
Basically,
Yes.
this Tricon Global Restaurants Incorporated in 1997.
Globalists.
It came out of PepsiCo. It's kind of obfuscated as to who owns what here, but I think they all got merged.
I just
corporatized.
got to point out that I have fond memories of going to Pizza Hut when I was a kid. When you would get the book it thing, and you'd get the little wheel or whatever with all the things you win, and you go in and you get like a little pizza because you read the books or whatever.
Yeah.
And Jack is obviously making he's being silly about it, but there are people on the left that are really upset about Jack's statements about Pizza Hut that genuinely confuse me. It was fun going to Pizza Hut when we were kids. Everything else is meant to be more silly and a joke, but talking about how the things we did back then we don't do anymore, and it kind of sucks. And times won't stay the same forever. But it's just funny how angry they got.
Well, they hate fun.
Yeah.
They literally hate
That's
fun.
true. Yeah.
People have
I disagree.
nostalgia.
I think they're addicted to it.
People have nostalgia for their childhoods all the time, obviously, because your childhood was the time before everything got so complicated. But that is also true, like on a real societal level in this particular age, as well. Like, I don't know how old all of you guys are exactly, but I'm like right at that age where I was right in that sweet spot where I lived enough of my life, about 20 years before I ever really got on the internet. I kind of knew about it, and I would,
How old are you?
I'm 40.
Oh, okay.
And so
36.
right at that
43.
age where you have enough experience of the world, what it was like before everybody had smartphones and everything, and yet you're young enough that you can pick it up and you can learn it and you can kind of get fully integrated. And it has it's radically changed things, and I think it's made things more complicated.
These kids today will not know the joy of hearing the phone ring and racing your sibling full speed to try and answer it first.
Yes.
Or watching something on television and having to like go grab your snack during the commercial break.
Yeah.
Actually, to be honest, though, that is coming back to a lot of streaming services.
Well, there was
real
quick, there's a funny post where someone said the kids today will never know the joy of rushing to the kitchen to grab snacks during a commercial break and your sibling yelling, "It's on."
That's right.
And then it was on Tumblr. Someone said they couldn't just pause it. And then someone said, "Oh, my sweet summer child."
Oh, but that's hilarious. But I will say I do think there's more to it than nostalgia. So you mentioned the filmmakers of the 70s, and I've heard it said that part of why Star Wars was so successful, and I'm not really much of a fan, but I've heard it argued part of why it was successful is because in that era, in the 60s and 70s, so much of what was being produced was depressing, but also sort of morally ambiguous. They didn't want to have a clear-cut good guy, bad guy narrative, but Star Wars leaned very heavily into that. And now you see a lot of fans arguing online on Twitter that we need to have the gray Jedi and this series needs to be more about moral ambiguity, even though a huge part of what made it successful was the fact that they were willing to draw clear lines between what's good and bad.
It was kind of a story of Christ. Star Wars, the first one, Luke was fighting against the Empire like Jesus did, and he had magic powers like Christ did and stuff like that.
Well, it's a hero's journey.
Yeah.
The hero's journey is very much. But I want to make a point. There's a meme where the NPC guy says, "Who radicalized you?" and then the Chad guy says, "I'm just a normal person from 10 years ago." A bunch of people on the left were like, "See, that proves you're conservative," and I'm just like, bro. Top surgery for 14-year-old girls. There's a big difference between being progressive and just like having no control. And my point was, the eugenics movement of the progressives in the 1900s died and was considered amoral or immoral and unethical. Just because the progressives think they're going to win doesn't mean their ideas are good. And just because you oppose them doesn't mean you're a conservative. You technically, I'd argue, if you're a progressive, you hold values from the early 1900s. That sounds a bit conservative.
What artificial insemination is eugenics? I brought this up before, and people messaged me and were like, "Thank you." That kind of got glazed over.
Well, unless you mate with the very first sexually available person you meet, then you're kind of a eugenicist, right?
Well, but I mean,
if we're any selectivity at all is like you're doing a little
kind of. But hold on, look at women going to sperm banks and then getting a catalog of the males to choose from, right? So I understand the argument that like a woman will make her choices, but eugenics, I think, is better defined by preventing people from procreating.
Yeah.
And so
I think it's choosing who they procreate with, whether it's no one
eugenics
or...
was about good breeding. The idea was that you would have the best possible breeding. Now, obviously, men and women both select their mates. So when a woman goes to a sperm bank and she's like, here's the catalog of men, it's like a guy wearing a suit, it's like IQ 145 and he's 6-figure salary. It's an extreme version of female selection, which it's like, okay, it's a weird modernity thing. But I think eugenics is really sour and bad when it was like, we must prevent this group from having kids or terminate the children that may have these traits.
Yeah, that's the ugly head of eugenics, that's for sure.
Yeah, mate selection, I think, is normal and fine. You know, a woman's going to be like, honestly, dude, I don't want to have a baby with you. It's like, well, that's life.
It used to be like the parents would choose who the kids married for most of history, I think. So it's relatively new.
And we found that to be wrong. You know, we did away with eugenics in terms of parents choosing who their kids would marry and dowries and all that. And then we also decided you should stop people from having kids, which is what Margaret Sanger wanted to do. Well, like look, whatever you want to argue about from the left, they want to say she wasn't racist, whatever, fine. But she did argue literally and fought very hard to stop certain people from having kids.
Yeah, no, she was absolutely racist and she was eugenicist. But I wouldn't argue that arranged marriage is eugenics because they were not selecting the partner for their child necessarily on the basis of something like genetic fitness. It could be this is a morally virtuous person and so I want my child to marry them.
Or the dad is rich.
Yeah.
Right.
It depended on the choice of the parent. They could be like, I want you to have the most beautiful wife, but usually it was for money.
I mean, when it came to the royal families, they did not care for genetics at all. So I wouldn't call that eugenics.
Yeah, it's about land rights and stuff. They want the wife to have ownership, like she's going to get the county of Brussels, so I'm going to marry her to my son who has the kingdom of England, and then they'll consolidate power.
All these kings in World War I were cousins?
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
So ridiculous.
That's what I hear. Before we go too far away from this Pizza Hut thing, Yum Food Brands was spun up to purchase KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut, and the top owners of Yum Food Brands are Vanguard, BlackRock
really?
at 4%, State Street at 4%,
Knew it.
T. Rowe Price Associates.
Dude, I just want to... When people say that meme reject modernity, embrace tradition, the one thing I will say, I mentioned before, when you're a tourist in key parts of the world, and you come to the famous downtown area of some city in some faraway country, and it's McDonald's, Starbucks, Gucci, Hard Rock Cafe, you just throw up a little bit. You're just like, what is this? Is this it? The world will have nothing left to offer us.
Yeah.
There's no adventure. There's no diversity. You know, the left talks about diversity all day and night, but I tell you, when I went to the Bahamas and I was like, I guess I'll go to Starbucks, I'm like, that's not fun.
The weird thing is when you're in another country and they only have like little like coffee shops where they're making the coffee and they're burning the bean and it doesn't taste, and you're like, oh, this is all. Then you see a Starbucks, it's like an oasis in the desert, and you're like, I can get a standardized thing that I know what it's going to taste like. Thank God. And you go there and you get a real coffee just exactly like it always tastes. No, and that's the upside of this,
dude.
Standardization.
Yeah. Like I'll tell you this: if I am in some small faraway country and their burgers are weird and gross, I still will not go to McDonald's.
Yeah. Not McDonald's. Starbucks
but
is
it's standard.
Decent.
No, Starbucks is. Oh,
okay.
Starbucks
It's okay.
cold brew I actually really like.
I think they have quality
I gotta
coffee.
get. I gotta have that because Starbucks cold brew is good.
McDonald's though, I
don't like Starbucks coffee, though.
I don't think of Starbucks as fast food really. I don't ever eat their food really.
So I wanted to say before we move on for this Pizza Hut thing, I would think that nostalgia would be the one thing that would be truly bipartisan, that everybody of about the same age would really resonate with. But you were talking about the sinews that hold people together at a very low level. I think this is one of those things. The fact that we can't even agree on some kind of fond childhood memory is kind of crushing to watch. Like, that's distressing that we don't even agree about that. What is wrong with us?
I think childhood today is being destroyed on purpose. I think we as millennials have a kind of shared experience in these cultural phenomena from when we were little, like Book It and Pizza Hut. So when Jack Posobiec posts the red cups and the little pan pizzas, many of us go, I remember that. Even if it was just one time you went because your school gave you those little things, like if you read enough books, the teacher would sign off and then Pizza Hut would give you a little free pizza so you'd get it. That's a shared cultural experience. Now what do we have?
Well,
The shared cultural experience is all like the weird stuff kids are being taught in schools.
Marvel movies.
I was just about to bring that up. I mean, childhood has in some way been redistributed to adults. So we've extended adolescence as far as we possibly could. And
Take a look at-
maybe not as far as we possibly could. We're probably pushing to extend it even further.
I've been saying this. They are preventing adulthood. That's what's happening, whether intentional or not. Puberty blockers preventing adulthood. Millennials have 3%. Fact check me on this one, but there's a meme going around. It's like millennials have 3% of U.S. wealth and boomers have 21%.
That sounds right.
It's the poorest generation in history. And I think it's because boomers are living longer. And I think it's because millennials were poorly raised.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. I also think that it's the case that when you look at the way children are raised today, I sort of mentioned that we've redistributed childhood, right? Because we prolong adolescence. But on top of that, it's not as if we give to children what was traditionally given to them. So at a very young age, 8, 9, 10 years old, a kid is handed a smartphone, which is a tool for an adult to use, but they just use it to do unrestrained, irresponsible things. And then they continue to do that until they're 30 instead of using this tool for something productive. So it's very strange, and it's a rejection of responsibility, sadly, and no culture can function once that becomes the status quo.
Let's poll the audience in a way that unashamedly promotes the show. Smash the like button if you think kids should not have cell phones.
There you go.
Yeah, what do you...
I've been thinking a lot about this because we talk about kids getting access to the internet. What age should they get access to the internet, and what's it going to do to their brain to have all that information blasted at me? And then I started thinking, you know what? That happened to me when I was 26 years old. I got on YouTube and people started hitting me with all this information. So I started looking up the Federal Reserve, fiat currency, the Bank of International Settlements, the American War Machine, liberal economic order. And I'm like, wow, we're not. I went insane. Society would have classified me as insane. I was completely destroyed mentally and had to rebuild what I thought I was. That's happening to kids when they're 5, 7, 8. And it's happening to adults when they're 60. So this internet's danger, man. It's the danger zone. It's a minefield for the mind. And we got to treat it like that.
Yeah, and it subverts this process of growing up, right? Where, like we were talking before the show about this plan I have for my kids, where I'm going to have like a library, and there's going to be bookshelves full of books so that the kids grow up and they're just used to there being books all around. And my plan is, like the books at the very bottom, those are going to be kids' books. You get up a little higher, those are going to be the ones where I can tell my kid, you're not ready for that yet. And then they're going to be like, oh, I want that book. Now, that's something that happened like with all of childhood back in the days. There were things that you were not old enough for yet, that you don't get to see that, you don't get to experience that yet. You're just not old enough. You're not at that point. And it creates that sort of yearning to mature and grow up. And now, because of smartphones and just the permissiveness of the way we raise kids, you're 7 years old. You can see anything. You can do anything.
I am shocked and offended by how you described what your children will be reading. Clearly, the only things they should be allowed to read are Harry Potter and The Handmaid's Tale.
Handmaid's Tale. Come on.
Handmaid's Tale. What was the joke?
We're making we're going to synthesize them and do a reboot that lefties will really pay money for. It's going to be called
Harry's
The Harry Handmaid. Harry Handmaid.
Harry.
What was like Harry Handmaid and the Sorcerer's Tale, something like that, Philosopher's Tale.
So good.
You're
I
a
like this,
handmaid, Harry.
I like this idea that you're going to have books for your kids in the future. One time my dad was telling, I was in the bathtub, I was like 6 or something or 7, and he started to tell me a joke, and then he was like, I'll tell you when you're older. And I was like, no, what? And he was like, I'll tell you when you're older. So like 15 years
And then it's like a
went
rite
by,
of passage when he finally tells you. You're like, oh, I've arrived.
Well, 15 years went by, and I asked him, what was that joke you were going to tell me? And he was like, I don't remember what you're talking about. So make sure they get a chance to read the books.
When I was little, we had cable. And the cable box, man, I remember this is crazy, had parental lock on it, 4-digit code. And whenever we wanted to watch Beavis and Butthead, my mom had to be like, only if I'm there, we can, I decide you're allowed to watch it. Because some of those episodes of Beavis and Butthead, not for little kids, but some of them were just hilarious.
Yeah, there's something my dad said to me when I was growing up, which is that, and he was referring to the television, but this is the first time in human history that people let complete strangers into their house to teach their children things without any kind of filter. And when you put it that way, it becomes clear just how alarming the situation is.
But
and yeah,
is this millennials doing it?
What do you mean? Millennials? Well, my dad is referring... No, he was referring to his own generation and the fact that they sit their kids in front of the television or don't police what they're watching. They don't filter any of it. And so it's very, very sad. It's very sad. And there are so many horrible things kids get into at an early age. I mean, we're not just talking about bad political theories or horrible advice. Children end up seeing pornography at a very early age, and it warps them.
Dude, when I was in 7th grade, we had that one kid that every male friend group has who was like the pervert kid, right? And he brought a couple of his dad's Playboys to school one time. And everybody like who found out about it was like, oh my God, no, he's got a couple Playboys. And then he got caught by the teacher, and we're like, well, he's dead. I mean, he's clearly going to be executed like on the playground. Like his life is completely over. And it's like now, today, little Johnny brings a cell phone to school, and you got to explain to your 6-year-old what X, Y, and Z are. That's terrifying.
And instead of being like kids shouldn't have cell phones, you have these teachers being like kids have questions.
Yep.
And we're going to answer them and show them graphic pictures. I love it. The Washington Post's writing that op-ed where it's like, it's a book about being genderqueer and kids need these stories. And it's being banned now. And then Amazon's like 18 and up only because it's got graphic depictions of adult activities in it.
Well, and they would not put the actual images from the book in their publication because they knew they were too depraved. But they were arguing that children should be shown those images in public schools.
That's how you know they're creeps.
Yep.
Because they know what's in the book and they're lying.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, actually, if you go back to the late 60s, how many of the radicals from that era, after they got done being, fake revolutionaries, went into early elementary education or like went into the educational training. You have guys like Daniel Cohn-Bendit out in France. He was a big revolutionary 68 guy out there. And afterwards, he went and opened a kindergarten. And then he wrote a memoir about it a few years after that. And he talked about, this is like in the mid-70s, talking about how, there's all of this sexual repression is what leads to fascism and the authoritarian personality and everything. And so if he caught like a couple of his kids like fondling each other or something, he would just sit there and like talk to them while they did it and make sure they were comfortable. Sometimes they would come up and touch him.
What?
Jeez.
This guy became like a politician in France. Nobody cared. It got brought up sometime in the late 90s. They tried to like use it against him and nobody cared.
Yes. So I've mentioned this on the show before, but there's a fellow by the name, or a disgusting pervert by the name of Alfred Kinsey, and he is known as the father of the sexual revolution. He is the father of sexology, or the modern scientific field of studying human sexuality. And in his published works, he had data tables that were collected by sexually abusing young boys, and this had been done to over 200 minors, boys under the age of 15, including infants. I won't explain what the data tables say on air. It's really disgusting. But so much of this stuff is completely out in the open. And the boomer generation is comedic in a sense, because I remember growing up watching movies that the boomer generation made about how heroic the boomer generation was. And there's this idea that they were these brave revolutionaries because their parents, who had just lived through the Great Depression and then fought in the Second World War, came home and said, we have some advice on how the world works and you should listen to us. And they said, screw you, Mom and Dad, I'm going to have one-night stands and listen to rock and roll. And this is considered this really brave and important revolution. It was just a bunch of spoiled children. It was just a bunch of spoiled children completely tarnishing and squandering their inheritance.
Thanks for checking out this segment from the Timcast IRL podcast. But if you want to check out the full show live, tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. And if you want more special access content, head over to timcast.com and become a member. Your membership helps sustain this company, keep our journalists employed, makes this show happen, and you will get access to exclusive members-only segments of the Timcast IRL podcast, and there's a massive library to check out. So again, go to timcast.com or tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., and we'll see you all there.